Numbers were the only language Egon truly trusted. They possessed a pristine, unyielding honesty that humans severely lacked. Sitting in his dimly lit Zurich office, the rain blurring the city lights into streaks of gold, he stared at the glowing spreadsheet of his joint financial portfolio with Ginevra. It was a routine quarterly check, a habit born from 10 years as a senior risk analyst. Everything was balanced. Everything was perfect, until his eyes caught a slight anomaly. A recurring, obscure insurance premium tethered to a commercial lease he had never authorized. A lease co-signed by his wife and his oldest, most trusted friend, Zelie. The warmth of his expensive coffee suddenly turned to ash in his mouth. He didn't scream. He didn't reach for his phone to demand answers. Instead, the risk analyst in him took over, freezing his heart and sharpening his mind. There was a secret hiding in these decimals, a betrayal meticulously calculated. If stories of silent devastation and the cold, unyielding pursuit of retribution speak to your darker curiosities, stay with me. The rain in Zurich rarely fell with any sense of drama. It was precise, cold, and relentless, much like the city itself. Egon sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his home office, the muted glow of his dual monitors casting a pallid light across his sharp, exhausted features. It was 2 a.m. In the master bedroom down the hall, his wife of 10 years, Ginevra, was sleeping soundly, her breathing a soft, rhythmic metronome of domestic tranquility. Egon was a risk analyst. His life was built on the foundation of predicting the unpredictable, of finding the invisible fault lines in massive corporate structures before they collapsed. It was a lucrative, demanding career that required a mind devoid of emotional bias and obsessed with empirical truth. Tonight, he was merely applying that same rigorous scrutiny to his own life, consolidating their quarterly personal accounts to prepare for the upcoming tax season. He scrolled through the ledgers, his eyes scanning rows of familiar data. Mortgage payments, luxury car leases, Ginevra's exorbitant but predictable expenditures at the art galleries, his own modest investments. It was a symphony of wealth and stability. Then, the cursor stopped. There was a line item buried deep within a subsidiary joint account they rarely used. It was a monthly deduction of 4,500 Swiss francs. The descriptor was vague: ZG Holdings, premium liability. Egon frowned. He possessed an eidetic memory for numbers and contracts. He had never approved, let alone heard of, a corporate entity named ZG Holdings. Furthermore, the routing number indicated an offshore insurance premium linked to a commercial real estate lease. Why would they be paying commercial liability on a property they didn't own? His fingers moved across the keyboard with the swift, lethal precision of a surgeon. He bypassed the standard banking portal, utilizing the deeper investigative software he used for corporate fraud detection. He traced the routing number, peeling back the layers of digital obfuscation. The system hummed, cross-referencing public records, business registries, and insurance databases. 5 minutes later, the screen refreshed, displaying the registered documentation for ZG Holdings. Egon's breath hitched, trapping the cold air in his lungs. The company was a private LLC registered 6 months ago. The primary shareholder and signatory was Ginevra. The co-signer, holding exactly 50% equity, was Zelie. Zelie, his oldest friend. The woman he had known since university. The woman who had stood beside him at his wedding. The woman who had just last weekend sat at their dining table, laughing and pouring expensive Bordeaux. Egon stared at the screen, a strange, creeping numbness spreading from his chest to his extremities. He clicked further, accessing the commercial lease attached to the holding company. It was for a high-end luxury loft in the Seefeld district. A private, secluded space. But what froze the blood in Egon's veins was the attached life insurance policy. It was a massive, aggressive policy taken out on Egon's own life, with the premiums being siphoned directly from his corporate dividends. The sole beneficiaries in the event of his untimely death or severe incapacitation were Ginevra and Zelie. The numbers painted a picture so grotesque, so meticulously cruel, that his mind initially refused to process it. They weren't just hiding a business venture. The financial structure was designed to quietly drain his liquid assets, legally bind him to astronomical debt, and ultimately leave them profoundly wealthy if he were to vanish. He slowly pushed his chair back from the desk. The silence of the apartment was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a monumental lie. He stood up and walked silently down the hallway, stopping at the threshold of the master bedroom. The soft glow of a street lamp filtered through the blinds, illuminating Ginevra's face. She looked angelic, serene, her dark hair fanned out across the silk pillowcase. Egon stood there in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The instinct to wake her, to scream, to demand an explanation, clawed at his throat. But Egon was a risk analyst. He knew that reacting emotionally was the fastest way to lose the war. If he confronted her now, with only a fraction of the puzzle, she would panic. She would destroy evidence, move the remaining funds, and gaslight him into oblivion. He closed his eyes, inhaling the faint scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air. When he opened them again, the loving husband was dead. Only the auditor remained. He turned away from the bedroom and walked back to the cold glow of his monitors. He sat down, cracked his knuckles, and began to build a trap. The glow of the monitor was the only light in the study, casting long, distorted shadows against the mahogany bookshelves. Egon sat unmoving, a statue of flesh and bone, as the clock on the wall methodically ticked toward 4 in the morning. The initial discovery of ZG Holdings was merely the entry wound. Now, he was probing the depth of the bullet. He utilized a decryption algorithm, a software tool strictly reserved for high-stakes corporate espionage audits, to breach the private email server registered under the holding company's domain. It took 20 minutes of agonizing loading bars and proxy bypass protocols. When the inbox finally rendered on his screen, it felt as though he had pried open a tomb. There were hundreds of threads. At first glance, they were mundane discussions about furniture deliveries for the Seefeld loft, utility bills, and transferred funds. Egon traced the money. They were meticulously siphoning his quarterly bonuses, routing the capital through a labyrinth of shell accounts disguised as phantom art appraisal fees for Ginevra's consultancy. It was brilliant. It was insidious, but it was the attachments that broke the final, fragile seal on his reality. He clicked on a thread titled Moving Day, dated 3 months prior, the exact weekend Ginevra had claimed she was attending an exclusive gallery opening in Basel. The image loaded with agonizing slowness. It was a photograph taken inside the loft, the sprawling windows showcasing the dark, evening waters of Lake Zurich. But Egon's eyes did not register the scenery. In the center of the frame, bathed in the warm light of a floor lamp, were Ginevra and Zili. They were tangled together on a pristine white sofa. Zili's hand was woven into Ginevra's dark hair, their faces pressed together in a moment of unguarded, intoxicating intimacy that Egon had not seen in his wife's eyes for years. A sharp, physical wave of nausea hit him. He clamped a hand over his mouth, the metallic taste of bile rising in the back of his throat. He forced himself to swallow it down, his chest heaving silently in the suffocating quiet of the room. 10 years of marriage. 20 years of friendship with Zili. Every shared dinner. Every clinking wine glass. Every vacation where he had been the oblivious third wheel in his own life. The memories rapidly replayed in his mind, stripping away the innocence, revealing the mocking undercurrents he had been too trusting to see. The lingering glances across the dining table. The hushed conversations that stopped when he entered the room. The time Zili had stayed in their guest room, supposedly too tired to drive home. He hovered his mouse over the next email, his hand trembling slightly. The dilemma was agonizing. He could close the laptop right now. He could pack a bag, walk out into the freezing rain, and let the lawyers handle the wreckage. It would be the easiest way to preserve whatever shredded remnants of his sanity remained. But walking away meant surrendering. It meant letting them execute their flawless exit strategy. A risk analyst never leaves a variable unaccounted for. Egon exhaled a long, shuddering breath. His trembling fingers steadied, the flesh turning to ice. He right-clicked the master folder and began a mass download, transferring every email, every financial ledger, every damning photograph into a heavily encrypted, offline drive hidden beneath his desk. He was no longer a husband looking at his wife. He was an auditor looking at a catastrophic system failure. The pain was still there, a jagged rock in his stomach, but he compartmentalized it, burying it beneath a glacier of absolute resolve. As the progress bar reached 100%, Egon closed the laptop. The profound darkness of the study rushed back in. He had the proof. Now, he needed to build the architecture of their ruin. The transition from night to day brought no relief, only the harsh, unforgiving light of a new reality. Egon showered in scalding water, hoping the heat would melt the ice that had calcified in his chest. He dressed in his usual charcoal bespoke suit, adjusting his tie in the mirror. The man looking back at him appeared entirely unchanged. His pulse was a steady 60 beats per minute. A perfect baseline. "You were up late," Ginevra murmured from the bed as he walked into the bedroom to retrieve his watch. She stretched gracefully, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. Her voice held the familiar, sleepy warmth he had loved for a decade. "End of quarter audits," Egon replied smoothly, fastening the platinum clasp at his wrist. The numbers were being stubborn. "Don't work yourself into the ground, Egon," she said, offering a soft, affectionate smile. "We have dinner with Zili tonight, remember? She's bringing that burrolo you like." The mention of her name felt like a physical blow to his ribs, but Egon's expression remained an impenetrable mask of mild amusement. "I haven't forgotten. I'll be home by 6. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Her skin was warm. Her scent, a delicate mix of vanilla and expensive night cream, suddenly made him want to retch. He walked out of the apartment, leaving the ghost of his marriage behind. By the time evening arrived, the Zurich skyline was a blanket of shimmering indigo. The dining table in their penthouse was impeccably set. When the doorbell rang, it was Egon who answered. Zili stood in the hallway, shaking the rain from her designer trench coat. She held up a bottle of 2015 Burrolo with a triumphant grin. "Traffic on the bridge was a nightmare, but I come bearing gifts," she announced, stepping forward to embrace him. As she wrapped her arms around his shoulders, Egon held his breath. He felt the familiar texture of her wool coat, smelled the sharp, citrus notes of her signature perfume. This was the woman who had helped him pick out Ginevra's engagement ring. Now he knew exactly how much of his money was currently sitting in her offshore liability account. He patted her back, his hands completely devoid of warmth. "Good to see you, Zili." Dinner was an exercise in psychological endurance. Egon sat at the head of the table, cutting his steak with precise, rhythmic motions, observing the two women as if they were specimens under a microscope. He noticed the things he had previously been blind to. The way Ginevra's gaze lingered on Zili's lips when she spoke. The subtle, synchronized rhythm of their laughter. The fraction of a second their hands brushed when passing the salt. "The new gallery space in Seefeld is opening up beautifully," Zili remarked casually, taking a sip of the red wine. "The light there is incredible for the installations." Seefeld, the location of their secret luxury loft. Ginevra smiled over her wine glass. "I can't wait to see it fully furnished. It has so much potential." "It does," Egon chimed in, his voice perfectly even, a pleasant, supportive hum. "Real estate in Seefeld is a fantastic long-term investment. You both have excellent taste." He watched the micro-expressions flash across their faces. A momentary flicker of surprise, followed instantly by the arrogant comfort of those who believe they are infinitely smarter than their mark. They thought he was a fool, a walking ATM who was blindly funding their romantic getaway. The psychological toll of maintaining the lie was immense. A persistent pressure built behind Egon's eyes, a headache born from the friction of two conflicting realities colliding in his brain. He wanted to shatter the crystal wine glass against the wall. He wanted to slide the printed emails across the polished mahogany table and watch the color drain from their beautiful, treacherous faces. Instead, he raised his glass, the dark red liquid catching the light of the chandelier. "To good investments," Egon toasted, looking directly into his wife's eyes. and then his best friends. And to the people we trust with them. They clinked their glasses against his, completely unaware that the auditor had already finalized their death warrant. The morning sun over Zurich was piercingly bright, reflecting off the steel and glass of the banking district like a billion shattered diamonds. Egon arrived at his office 30 minutes early. The silence of the empty floor was his sanctuary. Here, amidst the towering servers and the hum of high-frequency trading algorithms, he was not a betrayed husband. He was a god of risk mitigation. He poured a black coffee, sat at his desk, and brought up the schematic of his financial life. It was a sprawling, interconnected web of corporate accounts, real estate holdings, and liquid assets. To the untrained eye, it was chaotic. To Egon, it was a perfectly tuned engine. Ginevra and Zelie had designed an exit strategy based on a fundamental flaw in his current setup: trust. The life insurance policy and the commercial lease under ZG Holdings were anchored to his primary corporate dividend account. If they triggered the liability clause, perhaps by orchestrating a catastrophic failure in his business or, more chillingly, an accident, the debt would instantly default to him, while the insured payout would funnel directly into their offshore shell. It was a brilliantly cruel maneuver, reliant entirely on Egon remaining oblivious until the trap sprang shut. But they had underestimated the sheer, terrifying processing power of an auditor with nothing left to lose. Egon's fingers danced across the keyboard. He didn't just need to stop the bleeding. He needed to build a labyrinth that would entomb them when they finally tried to cash out. His first move was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation. He created a secondary, opaque holding company in Liechtenstein, a jurisdiction known for its impenetrable financial privacy laws. Using his high-level executive clearance and a series of complex corporate maneuvers that bordered on the arcane, he began the agonizingly slow process of migrating his core assets out of his personal name. He didn't move the money directly. That would trigger a massive red flag on Ginevra's joint account monitoring app. Instead, he initiated a series of sophisticated internal corporate loans and investments into phantom subsidiaries. He was essentially bleeding his own primary accounts dry, replacing the solid capital with complex, illiquid promissory notes that looked entirely legitimate on a standard spreadsheet, but were ultimately worthless to anyone trying to liquidate them quickly. It took 5 hours of intense, uninterrupted focus. By noon, his shirt collar was damp with sweat, but his eyes were clear, sharp, and cold. He had successfully hollowed out the very foundation of his wealth, transferring the actual value into an untouchable trust located 3 countries away. But Egon knew that simply protecting himself was insufficient. Retribution required them to feel the precise agony of losing everything they thought they had secured. He accessed the joint account he shared with Ginevra, the one they were using to siphon funds into ZG Holdings. He deliberately left a substantial, tantalizing amount of liquid cash sitting idle in the account, a perfect bait. Then, using his deep connections within the murky waters of international corporate finance, he located a highly volatile, exceptionally risky corporate bond issued by a failing logistics firm in Eastern Europe. It was a financial black hole, guaranteed to collapse under its own weight within months. Egon began subtly altering his own investment portfolio algorithms, leaving digital breadcrumbs that suggested he was quietly moving his own personal funds into this specific bond, anticipating a massive, secret payout. He crafted fake emails to his broker, meticulously designing them to look like intercepted communications, and left his tablet unlocked on his bedside table, just long enough for a curious eye to catch a glimpse. He leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his dark eyes. He was no longer just an auditor. He was the architect of their ruin. He had built the cage, secured his own exit, and now, all he had to do was leave the door open and wait for the rats to run inside. Sunday mornings in the penthouse were traditionally reserved for quiet luxury. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long pools of gold across the chevron hardwood floors. Outside, the surface of Lake Zurich was a crisp, sparkling blue. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of freshly ground espresso and the silent, invisible venom of deceit. Ginevra sat at the kitchen island, draped in a cashmere robe, her manicured fingers tapping thoughtfully against a tablet. She was reviewing architectural renderings for what she claimed was an expansion of her art consultancy. Zelie, who had dropped by to drop off some exhibition catalogs, leaned against the marble counter, sipping her coffee with an air of absolute possession. Egon sat at the dining table, ostensibly engrossed in the weekend edition of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. In reality, he was studying them. He watched the way Zelie's gaze would drop to the opening of Ginevra's robe when she thought he wasn't looking. He noted the microscopic shifts in their body language, a shared language of lovers hiding in plain sight. The contractors for the Seefeld space are being utterly unreasonable. Ginevra sighed, a perfectly calibrated sound of elegant distress. They want a 50% deposit up front for the custom lighting rig. It's tying up a tremendous amount of the consultancy's operating capital. Zelie offered a sympathetic hum, her eyes flicking toward Egon. It is a prime location, Jin. You can't compromise on the lighting if you want to attract high-net-worth buyers. Egon slowly lowered his newspaper, adopting the warm, indulgent expression of a man whose only desire was to see his wife succeed. Is there a cash flow issue, darling? Ginevra offered him a tight, slightly embarrassed smile. It was a masterful performance. Just a temporary bottleneck. I might need to liquidate some of the lower yield stocks from my personal portfolio to cover it. Nonsense, Egon said smoothly, his voice vibrating with steady, husbandly reassurance. You shouldn't disrupt your long-term holds for a short-term liquidity gap. How much do the contractors need? Ginevra named a figure. It was exorbitant, nearly double what a legitimate lighting installation would cost. Egon knew instantly that the surplus was destined for ZG Holdings' offshore liability premiums. He didn't blink. Instead, he chuckled softly, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. Ginevra, if you are going to establish a presence in Seefeld, you must do it flawlessly. Don't let petty cash restrict your vision. I'll transfer double that amount into your primary operating account by tomorrow morning. Ginevra's eyes widened, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through her carefully constructed mask. Egon, that's incredibly generous. But are you sure? That's a significant amount of liquid capital. I am entirely sure, Egon replied, standing up and walking over to the kitchen island. He placed a hand gently on his wife's shoulder, feeling the slight, involuntary tension in her muscles. Actually, I've recently reallocated a substantial portion of my own portfolio into a highly aggressive Eastern European logistics bond. The projected yields are staggering. We have more than enough liquidity to fund your ambitions. He let the lie hang in the air, a glittering, poisonous lure. Zelie lowered her espresso cup. The predatory glint in her eyes was unmistakable, a sudden, sharp hunger awakened by the mention of the high-yield bond. She glanced at Ginevra. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. They thought they had struck gold. They believed they were bleeding a wealthy, gullible man who was practically begging to finance his own destruction. You're a good man, Egon, Zelie said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet sincerity. Ginevra is lucky to have someone who supports her dreams so unconditionally. I only want what is best for her, Egon agreed, his face an impenetrable mask of devotion. He turned his back to them, walking toward his study to process the transfer from the heavily monitored bait account. He smiled, cold and sharp, to the empty hallway. The pigs were walking willingly into the abattoir, entirely unaware of the butcher waiting inside. The winter air in Zurich possessed a biting clarity that mirrored Egon's mental state. It had been 4 weeks since he discovered the existence of ZG Holdings. 4 weeks of smiling at the woman who was draining his accounts and pouring wine for the best friend who was sleeping in his bed. The psychological strain was a constant, low-grade fever, but the architecture of his retaliation was nearly complete. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind of quiet, domestic night that had once felt comforting but now felt like a stage play with a hostile audience. Ginevra was in the living room, her laptop balanced on her knees, presumably reviewing invoices for her art consultancy. Zelie was there, too, an almost permanent fixture now, nursing a glass of scotch and reviewing an auction catalog. Egon entered the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of poorly concealed excitement. He spoke in rapid, hushed German, using the sharp, decisive terminology of high finance arbitrage. Yes, Herr Becker. No, bypass the secondary market. I want direct acquisition of the Class C tranches. The restructuring announcement is guaranteed for Thursday. The yield spread will be historic. Yes, liquidate the remaining tech equities to cover the position. We go all in. He ended the call, breathing heavily, and ran a hand through his hair, his eyes bright with fabricated adrenaline. He walked over to the minibar and poured himself a neat whiskey, his hand intentionally trembling slightly. The silence in the room was absolute. Both women were staring at him. Egon, Ginevra asked softly, her brow furrowed in a perfect imitation of wifely concern. What was that about? You seem agitated. Egon took a slow, deliberate sip of the whiskey, letting a triumphant smile touch the corners of his mouth. He walked over to the sofa and sat down heavily, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. He looked around the room as if checking for listening devices. I shouldn't say anything, he murmured, his voice thick with a conspiratorial thrill. It's highly confidential. But I think I just secured our retirement. 5 times over. Zelie slowly lowered her catalog, her eyes narrowing, the predator sensing blood in the water. Retirement? Egon, you're not even 40. What kind of position are we talking about? He hesitated, a masterful display of internal debate, before leaning in closer. That Eastern European logistics bond one mentioned a few weeks ago? The Volkov Consortium? I just got back-channel confirmation. They aren't restructuring. They are being acquired by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The announcement hits the wires on Thursday. The bond value is going to explode overnight. It's a guaranteed 600% return within 90 days. He saw the microscopic intake of breath from Ginevra. He saw the avarice flash across Zelie's face like lightning across a dark sky. They were hooked. But Egon, Ginevra said, her voice trembling slightly. That sounds incredibly risky. Are you sure? You've always been so conservative with our portfolio. That was before I had insider confirmation, Jen, he replied smoothly, placing his hand over hers. I've liquidated nearly everything liquid I have to maximize the buy-in. I'm even considering taking a short-term loan against the penthouse to leverage more capital. Opportunities like this happen once in a lifetime. He let the silence stretch, heavy with the weight of unimaginable wealth. He watched the gears turning in their heads. They had millions stashed in the offshore accounts of ZG Holdings, money they had siphoned from him, money meant to sustain them when they finally triggered his financial ruin. Now, he was offering them a chance to multiply that stolen wealth exponentially, to walk away not just comfortable, but staggeringly rich, before they even needed to execute their final betrayal. It's a shame, Egon added, sighing softly and leaning back against the sofa cushions. The minimum buy-in for the institutional tranche is steep. If you two had any significant liquid capital in the consultancy, or elsewhere, I could fold it into my block purchase. The returns would be astronomical. But, obviously, the Seefeld renovations are tying up your cash. He took another sip of his whiskey, his eyes completely dead behind his smiling facade. He had placed the bait on the hook. Now, he only had to wait for them to bite. The penthouse felt less like a home and more like a high-stakes casino where the air conditioning was broken. It was Tuesday evening, 48 hours before Egon's fabricated deadline for the Volkov Consortium bond. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, a static charge that made the hairs on Egon's arms stand up. He was in his study, supposedly finalizing the paperwork for his massive, fictional buy-in. In reality, he was monitoring the digital tripwires he had set around the offshore accounts of ZG Holdings. The silence in the apartment was profound, broken only by the soft murmur of voices from the living room. Ginevra and Zelie were discussing art. Egon knew exactly what they were discussing. He walked into the living room, a stack of heavily redacted, official-looking documents in his hand. His face was flushed with manufactured stress, his tie slightly loosened. He dropped the papers onto the coffee table with a heavy thud, rubbing his temples. The window is closing faster than I anticipated, Egon announced, sinking into an armchair. The institutional tranche for Volkov is nearly fully subscribed. I had to pull favors just to keep my allocation open until tomorrow afternoon. Ginevra paused her conversation with Zili, her eyes darting to the documents. The sheer volume of the paperwork, the dense legalese, and the prominently displayed logos of international brokerage firms lent his lie a devastating credibility. "Is there a problem with your funds clearing, Egon?" Zili asked, her voice a study in casual neutrality. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, a posture of predatory focus. "You mentioned liquidating assets. Sometimes international wire transfers can be sluggish." Egon let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. It was a flawless performance of a man overwhelmed by opportunity. "My primary capital is secure, but I'm short on the final leverage to maximize the position. I need an additional 3 million Swiss francs in liquid capital by 3 p.m. tomorrow to secure the preferred yield rate. If I don't hit the threshold, my entire block gets downgraded to standard returns." He looked directly at his wife. The desperation in his eyes was real, but it was not for money. It was a desperate plea for her to fall into the abyss she had dug for him. 3 million, Ginevra repeated softly, the color draining slightly from her face. It was the exact amount they had managed to siphon into ZG Holdings over the past 6 months. It was their entire escape fund. That's a tremendous amount of money to raise overnight. Egon nodded slowly, a picture of defeated ambition. "I know. It was a calculated risk that didn't pay off. I'll just have to accept the lower yield. It's still a profit, but..." He let the sentence hang, heavy with the implication of lost millions. "It's a shame. If only we had access to an external, liquid pool of capital. Even a short-term loan against a business entity would double our returns within 90 days. He stood up, gathering the papers from the table with a heavy sigh. "I'll call Becker and tell him to downgrade my position. It's fine. We're still comfortable, Ginevra." He turned his back on them and walked slowly toward his study, feeling the intense, almost physical weight of their stares burning into his spine. He had played his final card. He had given them the perfect, agonizing choice: walk away with their stolen 3 million and execute their original plan, or risk it all for the promise of 20 million and a life of unimaginable luxury, independent of the man they were betraying. When the study door clicked shut, Egon slumped against it, his breathing shallow and rapid. The adrenaline coursed through his veins like battery acid. The psychological toll of the charade was crushing him. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back a wave of nausea. He was a risk analyst, a man of numbers and logic, but there was no algorithm to process the visceral agony of watching the two people he loved most eagerly conspire to slit his throat for a payday. He checked his monitor. The ZG Holdings account remained untouched. The silence in the apartment was deafening. The trap was set. Now, he only had to wait for the snap. The silence in the penthouse on Wednesday morning was brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Egon sat at the kitchen island, a cooling cup of espresso in front of him, reading the Financial Times with an air of profound, manufactured distraction. It was 9 a.m., 6 hours until his fabricated deadline for the Volkov Consortium institutional tranche. The air conditioning hummed, a low, indifferent sound that contrasted violently with the frantic, invisible war raging beneath the surface of their domestic life. Ginevra entered the kitchen, fully dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer and silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. She looked incredibly beautiful and completely terrifying. There was a hard, brilliant glint in her eyes, a mixture of adrenaline and terrifying resolve that Egon had never seen before. She didn't look like his wife. She looked like a CEO executing a hostile takeover. "You look stressed, darling," she observed smoothly, pouring herself a cup of black coffee. Her voice was steady, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she raised the cup to her lips. Egon offered a weak, tightly drawn smile. "The Volkov deal," he murmured, rubbing his jaw. It's the missed leverage. I can't shake the feeling of leaving that kind of return on the table. It's an auditor's worst nightmare, knowing the exact algorithm for maximum yield and lacking the final input. Ginevra paused, her dark eyes locking onto his. And you are absolutely certain about the Chinese acquisition? The 600% return? It's a mathematical certainty, Jin, Egon replied softly, his voice a masterclass in suppressed desperation. But the window closes at 3 p.m. today. If I don't have the additional 3 million wired to the central clearinghouse by then, the entire block defaults to the standard rate. It's agonizing. He watched the calculation harden in her gaze. She was weighing the risk of immediate, massive wealth against the slower, meticulous plan of draining his life insurance policy after his staged ruin. The greed in her eyes was a physical force. I'll see you tonight, Egon, she said abruptly, setting her coffee cup down with a sharp clink. I have a meeting with Zelie at the gallery. She leaned down and kissed his cheek. The contact was brief, cold, and dismissive, the kiss of a woman who had already moved on. As the front door clicked shut, the penthouse descended back into absolute stillness. Egon remained frozen for a long moment, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering like poison in the air. Then, he stood up and walked steadily toward his study. The facade was gone. His face settled into the terrifying, absolute stillness of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He sat down at his multi-monitor workstation, entered his complex series of passwords, and brought up the deeply encrypted digital tripwires he had woven around the ZG Holdings offshore accounts. The interface was cold, black, and green. A pulsing cursor waited patiently for the inevitable data stream. The wait was agonizing. Egon sat motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyes locked on the primary monitor. 10 a.m. passed, then 11:30 a.m. He visualized Ginevra and Zelie in the Seefeld loft, hunched over a laptop, debating the catastrophic risk, completely unaware that the man they were trying to destroy was watching every keystroke through a backdoor algorithm. At 1:15 p.m., the primary monitor flared a brilliant, startling white. A notification pinged softly in the quiet study. Authorization received. ZG Holdings offshore account hashtag 8849. B recipient. Global Arbitrage Clearinghouse. Volkov Institutional Tranche Code. V77X. Amount. 3,150,000 Swiss franc status. Pending final clearance, Egon's breath caught in his throat. He watched the progress bar inch forward, a slow, methodical execution of their own destruction. They had done it. They had liquidated every cent of the stolen money and wired it directly into the toxic, collapsing bond he had designed solely for them. He leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He had embedded a final, fatal flaw in the transfer protocol. The money wasn't going to a legitimate clearinghouse. It was being routed into a heavily leveraged margin account anchored explicitly to the toxic Volkov bond under the name of ZG Holdings, with Ginevra and Zelie as the sole guarantors. At 1:22 p.m., the progress bar hit 100%. Status, cleared. Position executed. Egon exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The tension that had coiled around his spine for a month suddenly snapped, leaving him utterly hollow. He had won. The trap was sprung, the jaws locked shut. They had just chained themselves to a massive, toxic liability that would consume them completely. There was no joy, no triumphant scream. He simply stared at the confirmation screen, the cold glow of the numbers reflecting in his dark eyes. The architecture of their ruin was complete. Now, he only had to wait for the building to collapse. The air in the penthouse was suffocating, thick with the invisible smoke of a burning empire. It was Thursday evening, exactly 36 hours since Ginevra and Zelie had wired the stolen 3 million Swiss francs into the Volkov Consortium margin account. Egon sat at the dining table, his laptop open before him, an untouched glass of Lagavulin casting a long, amber shadow across the polished wood. He was waiting for the phone to ring. Across the city, in the Seefeld loft they had leased with his money, Ginevra and Zelie were undoubtedly celebrating. They believed they had just secured a 20 million franc payout, a flawless execution of their exit strategy. They believed Egon was sitting in his office, completely oblivious, happily anticipating a massive return on his own fabricated investment. They were wrong. At precisely 6:14 p.m., Egon's phone vibrated against the table. The caller ID flashed Zili Mobile. He let it ring 3 times, his pulse steady, his expression an impenetrable mask of cold anticipation. He picked it up on the 4th ring. Egon. Zili's voice was sharp, a jagged edge of panic slicing through her usual aristocratic composure. Egon, are you watching the markets? Egon took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, relishing the smoky burn in his throat. I'm looking at the quarterly projections now, Zell. Why? Is there an issue with the Seefeld lighting contractors? No, God damn it, Egon, she snapped, the facade of the supportive friend completely shattering. The Volkov bond. The Chinese acquisition. It was a lie. The whole thing was a fabricated press release by short sellers. The consortium just filed for insolvency in Luxembourg. The bond value has plummeted 98% in the last 10 minutes. He could hear the ragged, terrified breathing of his wife in the background. Egon, what does this mean? Ginevra's voice was a thin, reedy whisper, stripped of all its usual confidence. Egon leaned back in his chair, a chilling, absolute calm settling over him. He was a god of numbers, and he had just rewritten their universe. It means, Egon said, his voice a low, terrifyingly steady hum, that the institutional tranche I secured for us is essentially worthless. The leverage I used, it's gone. It's a catastrophic loss, Jin. But Egon, Zili interrupted, her voice shrill with rising hysteria, the margin account. The 3 million you said the leverage was secure. The broker? Ah, the additional leverage, Egon mused softly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Yes, the 3 million that was wired from ZG Holdings yesterday afternoon. I was surprised you two managed to liquidate so much capital from the consultancy so quickly. There was a profound, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The realization was dawning on them, a slow, horrifying sunrise of comprehension. He knew about ZG Holdings. Egon, Ginevra whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The problem with margin accounts, my dear, Egon continued, his tone conversational, devoid of any emotional inflection, is that when the underlying asset collapses, the broker issues a margin call to cover the leveraged debt. And since ZG Holdings was the sole guarantor of that specific 3 million franc position, and the bond value is now functionally zero, he paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy with the weight of their impending doom. The broker will immediately liquidate any remaining assets under ZG Holdings to cover the difference, which, according to my audit, is precisely nothing. Furthermore, the remaining liability will fall directly onto the personal guarantors of the holding company. He could hear a sharp intake of breath from Zili. You, Egon said simply, and Ginevra, you are personally liable for a margin call exceeding 15 million Swiss francs. A debt that will consume your gallery, Ginevra's consultancy, and everything you thought you had secured. You knew, Zili hissed, the venom in her voice finally unleashed, a desperate, cornered animal. You set this up. You magnificent bastard, you knew about us. Egon stared out the window at the glittering lights of Zurich, feeling the hollow ache in his chest expand, a vast, empty canyon where his marriage and his best friend had once been. He had won the war, but the battlefield was his own heart. I am a risk analyst, Zili, Egon replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper. I identify liabilities, and I eliminate them. I strongly suggest you both come to the penthouse. We have some final paperwork to review. He disconnected the call, leaving them alone in the dark with the crushing weight of their own greed. The penthouse was a mausoleum of high-end design, perfectly silent and unbearably cold. Egon sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, his posture rigidly straight. In front of him lay 3 pristine manila folders. Inside them were not just financial ledgers, but the autopsy reports of his marriage and his oldest friendship. The elevator chimed softly in the foyer. The sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor echoed through the apartment. Ginevra and Zelie appeared in the doorway of the dining room. They looked as though they had survived a car crash. Ginevra's flawless makeup was slightly smudged, her face pale and drawn. Zelie's usual arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the tight, feral energy of a trapped animal. They stopped at the threshold, staring at Egon, who remained motionless, his hands folded neatly over the folders. "Sit down," Egon commanded softly. His voice held no anger, only the chilling authority of an executioner. They moved toward the table, sinking into the leather chairs opposite him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Egon opened the first folder and slid it across the polished wood toward his wife. "Page 3, Egon said simply. Ginevra's hands trembled as she opened the folder. It was a printed copy of the ZG Holdings Incorporation documents, highlighting her signature and Zelie's as equal partners. Beneath it was the aggressive life insurance policy taken out on Egon, with them as the sole beneficiaries, premiums paid directly from his corporate dividends. Her breath hitched. She looked up, her dark eyes wide with a terrifying realization. Egon opened the second folder and slid it toward his oldest friend. Page 7. Zelie snatched the folder, her eyes darting across the page. It was a complete transcript of their private email server, detailing their affair, their disdain for him, and their meticulous plan to siphon his assets and leave him with a fabricated debt. Tucked behind the emails was a high-resolution printout of the photograph from the Seefeld loft, the two of them tangled together on the white sofa. Zelie's jaw clenched, the color draining from her face. She slammed the folder shut, her hands flat on the table. "You invaded our privacy. This is illegal, Egon. It's inadmissible." Egon let out a short, dry chuckle that held absolutely no humor. "Privacy," he repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. "You meticulously constructed a financial apparatus designed to ruin me, while sleeping in my bed, and you speak to me of privacy." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto Zelie's. The auditor was gone. The betrayed man finally allowed a fraction of his cold fury to seep out. "I didn't need to invade your privacy to find the ZG Holdings ledger. You left a glaring anomaly in a joint account. A sloppy, amateur mistake. From there, your entire house of cards was visible to anyone who knew how to look." Ginevra was staring at the photograph, her shoulders shaking silently. "Egon, please. You have to listen to me. It wasn't what it looks like. We were—" "Don't," Egon interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. "Do not insult my intelligence, Ginevra. Do not demean yourself further with lies. The numbers never lie. The emails are unambiguous. The life insurance policy is a masterclass in premeditated malice." He opened the third and final folder, keeping it entirely to himself. "This," he tapped the cover, "is the confirmation of the margin call from the broker handling the Volkov Consortium collapse." Both women froze, the oxygen seemingly sucked from the room. "The 3 million francs you wired from ZG Holdings yesterday was swallowed instantly," Egon explained, his tone returning to a deadly, conversational calm. "The margin call to cover the leveraged position currently sits at 16.4 million Swiss francs. As the sole guarantors of the holding company, you are both personally, jointly, and severally liable." Zelie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "We don't have 16 million francs. You know we don't. The gallery, the consultancy, they aren't worth a fraction of that." "I am acutely aware of your liquidity, Zelie," Egon replied softly. "I audited your businesses last night. By Monday morning, the broker will initiate asset seizure. Your gallery will be liquidated. Ginevra's consultancy will be dissolved. Your personal bank accounts, your cars, the lease on the Seefeld loft, everything will be seized to satisfy the debt." He paused, letting the absolute magnitude of their ruin settle over them like a shroud. "You tried to build a fortune on my grave," Egon said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Instead, you dug your own." Ginevra buried her face in her hands, a jagged, tearing sob ripping from her throat. The sound echoed in the massive, empty penthouse, a terrible symphony of consequence. Zelie stood frozen, staring at Egon with a mixture of pure hatred and dawning, helpless terror. Egon looked at them both, feeling nothing but a vast, icy emptiness. He had balanced the ledger, but the cost of the audit was everything he had ever loved. The sound of Ginevra's quiet sobbing was the only noise in the penthouse, a pathetic counterpoint to the absolute stillness of Egon's posture. Zelie remained standing, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes burning with an impotent, furious panic. "You orchestrated this," Zelie hissed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You set up the Volkov bond. You knew it was toxic. You manipulated us into transferring the ZG funds. This is entrapment, Egon." Egon's expression didn't flicker. He calmly closed the third folder and rested his hands on top of it. "A fascinating legal theory, Zelie. But let us review the empirical evidence. I did not force you to establish a hidden holding company. I did not compel you to siphon my corporate dividends. I certainly did not hold a gun to your head and make you wire 3 million francs into a high-risk margin account based on an overheard telephone conversation." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers, cold and entirely devoid of mercy. "You acted on greed. You executed the transfer of your own free will, utilizing funds you had embezzled. If you wish to argue entrapment in front of a Swiss magistrate, while simultaneously defending yourselves against charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and insurance fraud." He let the sentence hang, a guillotine suspended by a thread. "I welcome the litigation." Ginevra's head snapped up, her face streaked with tears, the terrifying reality of prison suddenly materializing alongside their financial ruin. "Criminal charges? Egon, please, you wouldn't. We're married." "We were married, Ginevra." Egon corrected her softly, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Currently, you are simply a liability I am excising from my portfolio." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew 2 thick, legally binding documents, sliding one toward Ginevra and the other toward Zelie. They were printed on heavy, cream-colored stock, the crest of a prominent Zurich law firm embossed at the top. "What is this?" Zelie asked, her voice tight, eyeing the document as if it were a venomous snake. "Salvation," Egon replied simply. "Or, more accurately, a stay of execution." He tapped the document in front of Ginevra. "That is a comprehensive divorce settlement. It stipulates a complete waiver of alimony, a full surrender of any claim to our marital assets, the penthouse, my corporate holdings, and my retirement accounts. It also includes a signed confession acknowledging your role in the embezzlement of funds through ZG Holdings, which will remain sealed unless you ever attempt to contest this agreement." He turned his gaze to Zelie. "Yours is a transfer of deed and a total relinquishment of equity. You will sign over your gallery, your personal investments, and the lease on the Seefeld loft to a holding company of my choosing. You will also sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the dissolution of my marriage and the nature of your financial collapse." Zelie's jaw dropped. "You want everything. You want to leave us with absolutely nothing." "You already have nothing, Zelie," Egon stated, his voice a chilling monotone. "You are currently 16.4 million francs in debt to a broker who will begin asset seizure on Monday morning. You are facing decades in prison for fraud." He leaned back in his chair, intertwining his fingers. "However, if you sign these documents right now, I will personally cover the margin call. I will assume the debt of ZG Holdings, and I will not forward my audit of your embezzlement to the authorities." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of their complete destruction. They were trapped in a vice of their own making, and Egon was slowly turning the handle. "You walk away with nothing, but you walk away free," Egon concluded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or, you refuse, and I let the broker and the police dismantle your lives piece by piece. The choice is entirely yours." He reached into his pocket again, withdrawing a sleek, silver Montblanc pen, and placed it precisely in the center of the table, equidistant between the two women. The polished metal gleamed under the chandelier, a silent, terrible ultimatum. Ginevra stared at the pen, her breath hitching in her throat, the fight completely drained from her. Zelie looked from the pen to Egon, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and profound, shattering defeat. They had thought they were playing a game of chess with a blind man. They hadn't realized he was the one who built the board. Egon watched them, his heart a cold, empty vault, waiting for the final signatures that would secure his absolute victory and seal his complete isolation. The air in the penthouse was suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the coppery tang of pure panic. The Mont Blanc pen lay in the center of the mahogany table, gleaming like a silver dagger. Egon sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of cold authority. The silence stretched until it felt as though the very walls of the apartment were screaming. Ginevra's hand trembled violently as she reached for the pen. The heavy cream stock of the divorce settlement felt like a death warrant beneath her fingers. She looked up at Egon, her dark eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. "Egon," she whispered, a desperate, pathetic croak. "Please. 10 years. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were going to bankrupt me and leave me holding a toxic liability while you bought a loft in Seefeld with my best friend." Egon finished for her, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was the absolute flatness of his tone that was so terrifying. There was no anger, no sorrow, only the chilling statement of an empirical fact. "Sign the paper, Ginevra." Her breath hitched in a jagged sob. She lowered her head, the curtain of her dark hair falling forward, obscuring her face. The scratch of the nib against the heavy paper sounded impossibly loud in the dead quiet of the room. She signed her name on the final page, a messy, frantic scrawl that barely resembled her elegant signature. She pushed the document toward him, her hands retreating quickly as if the paper itself were burning her. Egon picked up the settlement, his eyes scanning the final page with the precise, detached scrutiny of an auditor. He checked the date, the signature, the initialed clauses. It was perfect. The liability of Ginevra was formally excised from his life. He set the folder down and slid the pen toward Zelie. Zelie stared at the pen, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though her teeth might shatter. Her arrogant swagger, her aggressive possession of Egon's life, had entirely evaporated. She looked cornered, feral, and utterly broken. "You're a monster, Egon," she hissed, the words dripping with impotent venom. "You destroyed us. You manipulated us into wiping ourselves out." "I merely provided an opportunity, Zelie," Egon replied softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You chose the investment. You chose the holding company. You chose my wife. I am simply closing the ledger." He tapped a manicured finger against the transfer of deed document. 16.4 million francs, Zelie. The broker's system is fully automated. If this deed transfer and non-disclosure agreement are not executed and filed by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the margin call proceeds to asset seizure. Your gallery will be locked by noon. Your accounts will be frozen, and the financial police will have the ZG Holdings embezzlement file by Monday. He paused, letting the reality of her complete annihilation sink in. "Sign it," Egon commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "And walk out of my apartment with the clothes on your back." Zelie's hand shook as she picked up the pen. The defiance in her eyes wavered, replaced by a profound, sickening terror. She looked at Ginevra, who was still weeping silently into her hands, entirely broken. There was no solidarity left between them, only the desperate instinct for survival. Zelie bent over the document, her hand gripping the pen so tightly her knuckles were white. She signed the transfer of deed, the relinquishment of equity, the non-disclosure agreement. Every stroke of the pen was a violent severing of her livelihood, her reputation, and her future. When she finished, she shoved the documents across the table toward Egon, her chest heaving as if she had just sprinted a marathon. She stood up abruptly, the leather chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Are you satisfied?" Zelie spat, her voice thick with hatred and despair. "You have everything. Are you happy now, Egon?" Egon slowly gathered the signed documents, tapping their edges against the mahogany table to align them perfectly. He slid them into a fresh manila folder, his movements precise and unhurried. He didn't look at her. Happiness, Egon said quietly, staring at the smooth leather cover of the folder, is an irrelevant metric in a risk assessment. I have mitigated a catastrophic liability. I have balanced the books. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the two women who had dismantled his life. His eyes were entirely dead. The audit is complete. Leave. The finality of his command hung in the air, cold and absolute. Ginevra stood up, her legs trembling, unable to look at him. Zelie turned on her heel, her posture rigid with defeated fury. Together, they walked out of the dining room, the sound of their footsteps echoing hollowly in the massive, silent penthouse. Egon listened to the front door click shut, the heavy lock sliding into place, sealing him inside the pristine tomb he had built for his marriage. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Egon's chest. The penthouse, once a symbol of his shared success with Ginevra, now felt cavernous and profoundly empty. The scent of her perfume had already begun to dissipate, replaced by the sterile, metallic smell of rain against the glass windows. He stood up from the dining table, taking the manila folder with him. The documents inside represented total victory. He had secured his wealth, legally ruined the woman who had betrayed him, and completely dismantled the life of the friend who had aided her. Every risk had been mitigated, every variable accounted for. He walked into his study and placed the folder precisely in the center of his immaculate desk. He sat down in his leather chair and looked out over the glittering expanse of Lake Zurich. The city lights reflected on the dark water, a beautiful, cold abstraction. His eyes drifted down to the divorce settlement. Ginevra's frantic signature was blurred in one corner. Egon leaned closer. A single, distinct watermark stained the heavy cream paper just beneath her name. A tear. She had wept as she signed away her life. Egon stared at the tear-stained ink, expecting a surge of triumph, a final hit of vindictive dopamine. Instead, the icy fortress he had built around his heart over the past 2 months suddenly cracked. The sheer, overwhelming reality of what had transpired crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had won, but he had lost his wife. He had lost his oldest friend. He had lost the fundamental belief that anyone in his life could be trusted. He was richer than he had ever been, completely insulated from any financial threat, yet he was utterly, devastatingly alone. He reached out and traced the outline of the tear on the paper with a trembling finger. The auditor had flawlessly executed the protocol, but the man left behind was bankrupt in every way that mattered. The silence of the apartment was deafening, a hollow monument to a bitter victory. Egon closed his eyes, the darkness offering no comfort. The numbers never lie, Ginevra, he whispered to the empty room, his voice finally breaking under the crushing weight of his isolation. But you did.